As a data flow moves data from a source to a destination, you can perform various data flow transformations on the data. These transformation tasks let you look up data from an external source, change the contents of a field to uppercase, sort the data, merge the data flow with other flows, and lots of other things. The data flow task is the single most important task in a control flow, and it performs the majority of the work in an ETL, or extract, transform, and load process. If none of the built-in tasks do what you need, you can even build your own custom data flow task. But one word about that. It really is a very rare package that requires a custom component. This is because there's a script component for both control and data flows that let you write your own .NET code to process each row of data in the flow. These components support both Visual Basic and C#, unlike SQL Server 2005 and earlier versions that only supported Visual Basic. You can also reference custom assemblies or use just about any part of the .NET framework. Now, most integration services packages have at least one data flow task, but a package can include multiple data flows. Part of the planning for an entire integration services project is to figure out whether to split data operations into multiple packages or place multiple data flows in a single package. As you gain more experience with integration services, you'll start to develop a feel for which architecture is better for a particular solution. Now, data flows can contain several different components. The first, and probably the most important, is the data flow pipeline. This is the conduit through which data flows in a data flow task. This is where data moves to transformations and destinations starting from sources. And there's data flow sources. These take care of loading data from a data source. It might be a database table, Excel file, or almost any other kind of source where you can get data, and puts it into the data flow pipeline. And then there are data flow destinations. These load data from the data flow pipeline, so they have input that comes from the pipeline, and then puts it into a data destination. It might be a data warehouse or just about any other kind of data store, relational table, flat files, anything. So this can either be the data's final resting place or an intermediate store before you process the data further. And a data flow can also have data flow transformations. And this transforms data in the pipeline so that integration services can send the pipeline data in the correct format to a data flow destination. You can make almost any kind of change to the data you desire. You can completely change the shape and appearance of the data, whatever is necessary for the ETL process. And then finally, there are connection managers. These provide access to the physical data sources and destinations, again, like databases or flat files, and also access to virtual sources and destinations like data reader sources and record set destinations. So both something you save on disk someplace or some persistent storage, as well as in-memory kind of destinations. So connection managers provide the connection information that's used by those data sources and destinations, and they can be shared amongst multiple tasks within a data flow. Now, you don't necessarily need all of these components in a data flow task. You'll always have the pipeline, but the data source and destination, there's some wiggle room there. You won't always have transformations, but if you're connecting two sources and destinations, you'll need at least one connection manager. Okay, so there's a lot of flexibility in how you mix and match these components. All right, now a little bit more about the data flow pipeline. As data moves from sources through transformations and to destinations in a package's data flow, it's moving through one or more data flow pipelines. A pipeline uses in-memory buffers to isolate the data as it moves from sources through transformations into destinations. It's the flow of data within a data flow, and a single data flow can have multiple pipelines, so that's important to understand. Now, for most packages, you won't have to worry too much about the details of what the pipeline is doing. You'll visualize and build the paths that the data takes through the data flow using the data flow designer, but otherwise you don't usually need to sweat the details, the underlying pipeline details. The biggest issue is whether a component is synchronous or asynchronous, because this can have a big effect on performance. A synchronous component processes each row of data as it gets it and sends the result on its way down the pipeline right away. An asynchronous component blocks the pipeline, that's one way of thinking of it, until it receives all or most of the data that it'll eventually get from the pipeline. And then it processes it all at once and sends the results down the pipeline, whatever the subsequent tasks are. So an example of this would be an aggregate. You can't calculate the average of a set of values until you have all of the rows available, and then you can calculate the average and then send that average value down the pipeline, or additional rows, or whatever it is that you send down the pipeline. Okay, so I'll talk more about these kinds of concepts when I start talking about data flow components. Okay, so like I said, generally you don't need to worry too much about the details of the pipeline. But if you have a specialized need or a performance problem, you may need to get your hands dirty with the inner workings of the data flow pipeline. And Integration Services has various ways of controlling how the pipeline operates, as well as gathering performance information about what's happening at really a pretty low level. So thinking about the paths through a data flow as pipelines is a useful way to conceptualize what is happening to the data. All right, so let's talk more about these data sources and destinations. Almost by definition, you'll work a lot with data sources and destinations when you create a data flow in a package. This is really the core purpose of Integration Services and ETL. You take the data from one place in one form and move it to another place, maybe in a different form. And to do that, you have to get the data from somewhere and then put it somewhere else. Integration Services supports a wide variety of data sources and destinations, ranging from virtually every available relational database system to flat text files to various binary sources, including Excel spreadsheets. And I got to tell you, it always kind of amazes me just how much of the world's data is stored in spreadsheets, particularly Excel. So Integration Services has to work with that kind of rich store of data. Now, to some extent, the data sources and destinations abstract the process of reading and writing data. But each data source has its own needs, so you'll need to learn the unique capabilities of each store that you'll use and how to make use of it in a package. All right, so let's talk more in detail about data flow sources. Data flow sources provide connectivity to databases, flat files, XML files, and other physical as well as virtual data sources. Just about anywhere that data resides that you can move and use. A data flow source component reads data from some source somewhere and outputs data in columns into the data flow pipeline. So it's very important. You have input, which is the data store of some form, and then the output of a data flow source is then something that goes into the data flow pipeline. All right, so there's a number of data flow sources that are available. First one is an ADO.NET source. This is a data set that consumes data from a .NET provider and holds the data in memory. So it's an in-memory data source. So this is a very good tool, this component, for debugging data as it travels through your project. Then there's a CDC source, which is Change Data Capture. So Change Data Capture is a SQL Server feature that lets you capture just the change data from a source. This component lets you execute a query on the CDC change tables, reading the data from a table that has CDC enabled. And I mentioned there's Excel sources, so this is data from an Excel spreadsheet, and this goes back to, I believe, Excel 2003, so the .xls files, as well as the newer .xlsx files. Flat file source is a text file, comma separated file, or other type of file based in plain or delimited text. It's a lot of flexibility in how those are formatted. Then there's an ODBC source. This reads data from a data store that uses the ODBC API, kind of an older API. Generally, you should use the OLEDB data source for data stores that have it available, because it performs better, it's more feature-rich, and so forth. But there are some older data stores that only have ODBC, and so Integration Services supports that. And then, as I mentioned, there's the OLEDB source. So this uses an OLEDB provider. Most databases these days are compliant with the standard and have providers that either Microsoft provides or third parties provide. And this is a source you'll probably use most often to read data from a SQL Server database. fact, probably the source you use most often, period. And then there's a raw file source. This is data from a proprietary Microsoft format that they developed for faster transport of data than flat files. The raw file resembles a flat file, but the configuration of the file enables the developer to pick up the format of the data more easily because it's actually configured into the file. In contrast, a flat file source requires that you configure the format of the delimited columns in the file through a connection manager. So really the big difference is where that column information is stored, in the file itself or within the definition of the connection manager. And then finally, there's an XML source. This is data, oddly enough, from an XML file, which is extensible markup language, and that could be obtained in a DIS file or within a package variable. And you can optionally have the package validate the data against an XML schema. Now, most data flow sources require an underlying connection manager in order to supply access to the data source. The connection manager stores the information about how to connect to the source, such as a database, a relational database string, connection string, or a physical path to the text file, as well as the name of the file. And you can also include some other configuration information about how to access the data. The data source options for connection managers are available from the pop-up menu when you right-click down here in the Connection Managers pane. So this is just an empty package that I just created. So I'll right-click on this, and there you can see that you have an immediate link to a new OLEDB, new flat file, ADO.NET, analysis services, and new file connection. Now, each of these options actually provides various other options for different kinds of connections. So it's essentially a shortcut that makes it a little bit more efficient. If I know that I'm going to create a flat file, whether it's a delimited file, tab delimited, or various other formats, I can start here, and it's a little bit simpler. If you want to access all of the available connection types, you can select New Connection, and this displays all of the various types that Integration Services supports. So this New Connection option gives you the widest range of options for different connection managers. And even this list isn't exhaustive because a few of the options listed support a few different options themselves once you get into the dialog box where you actually create the connection. Now, when you select one of the options in the dialog box and then click the Add button, let me look at the HTTP connection. There. So you'll get another dialog box that's customized for that type of connection that you selected. And again, here's the connection information that's required to make a connection to using HTTP. Each of the editor dialog boxes collects the information necessary to make the kind of connection that you specified, such as file names and paths for file-based connections, and server name and authentication information for relational databases. As you can imagine, there's just a wide variety of kinds of information that's required for different kinds of connections. So as you can see, Integration Services provides enormous flexibility about where you read data from for use within a package. Okay, I'm going to cancel out of all this, because what I'm going to do now is create a new Integration Services project and configure an OLEDB data flow source that's going to read customer data from the AdventureWorks LT 2012 database. So during this exercise, I'm going to talk about the basics of creating a data flow. And then a little bit later, I'll use the same package to create a destination for the data and explore more about using data flows and how data moves through the data flow pipeline. Okay, I'll save that change just so I have it for later. But now I'm going to come to File, New Project, Integration Services. I'm going to browse down here to Control Flow, and I'll select that folder. So just a convenient location for the new project. And I'm going to name this project Data Flow. And click on OK, and it'll go out and create the project for us. And as usual, I like to rename packages so they're a little bit more meaningful. So I'll just name this Data Flow. But you're probably going to want to give it more of a functional kind of name. Say what the package does, the overall process that it's doing. All right, so here I'm in the control flow. First thing I need to do to create a data flow is add a data flow task to the control flow designer. Sometimes it's hard to grab. Come on. There we go. Okay, just wanted to move it out of the way a little bit from the corner. Okay, so notice I'm still in the control flow, but now I need to start working with designing the data flow. So two ways I can do that. I can either double-click the task or just go directly to the data flow tab there. If I double-click the task, I make sure that the data flow task opens with the correct data flow if I have more data flows within this package. But in this case, I only have one, so either method works just fine. Okay, and by the way, this behavior is a little bit different. The double-click behavior is a little bit different from other control flow tasks. Usually, when I double-click on a control flow task, it'll open up the task editor, but not the data flow task because it has its own designer. So it takes me over here. And then the other thing is that when I move to the data flow task designer, then I get the SSIS toolbox that's customized for the components that I can use on a data flow. So this is all now different from what appears when I have the control flow designer open. Okay, so don't be confused about how the toolbox is changing on you. All right, so I want to create a data source that is OLEDB because I want to use a SQL Server table. So I just double-clicked on that, and that puts it on the data flow. Oops, except I selected a destination. Don't want that. I actually want a data source. Right there. Okay, so now I have an OLEDB data source. And as usual, just like control flow tasks, the red X indicates that this component is not yet configured. There's some property settings, one or more property settings, that I haven't set yet. And specifically, I haven't told it anything, what database to use, what table to use, anything like that. Okay, so I'm going to double-click on the item, and that opens up this OLEDB source editor. So here's where I'm going to configure the connection to the AdventureWorks LT 2012 database. All right, now this is a new project. I don't currently have any OLEDB connection managers created. So I'm going to have to create a new one. So instead of using that option, I'll go to New. And now this identifies the different OLEDB connection managers that I have available within Data Tools. Now these appear because I've already created some connections, some data connections, using this instance of Data Tools. If I didn't have any, or if I needed to use a different database, then I could click on the New button and do all the work of creating a new connection. But in this case, I already have one for the AdventureWorks LT 2012 database, so I'm just going to go ahead and use that. And there's some basic information about the connection properties. So I can see probably the biggest thing if I'm going to reuse an existing one is to make sure that my security setting is valid for connecting for this particular package. Okay, so I'm going to use that connection manager right there, and that now appears here within the OLEDB connection manager. So I've essentially taken that OLEDB connection manager using the connection that was already defined within SQL Server Data Tools, and now it's available within this particular package. And notice that if I move this out of the way, this AdventureWorks LT 2012 connection manager is now available. It appears within the connection manager's pane here within the Data Flow Designer. Okay, now I need to tell it where the data is coming from because I'm back here in the OLEDB source editor. So I'm using this connection manager, so it's going to access this database. And then I have various options about where the data is going to come from. I'm going to get the data from a table, so I'm actually going to use the default table or view. But I can also get that information from a variable, or I can use a SQL command directly that I enter here within the source editor, or I can get the SQL command from a variable. So there's a lot of options about making this dynamic. So maybe a control flow task defines a variable that has a SQL command so that when this data flow executes, it uses some kind of customized on-the-fly kind of SQL command. Okay? But in this case, again, I'm just going to get the data from a particular table. And I'll select this drop-down box here. It loads all the tables within the AdventureWorks LT database, and I want to get the customer information. So I'll just select that. And that's how easy it is to set up to get information out of a SQL Server database. If I want to, I can preview the data, make sure that it looks like the right table, the right kind of data. Yeah, it has first name, middle name, last name, some basic information, password, salt, hash password, fortunately. Okay, so that all looks good. So I'll close out of that, and we're good to go. All right, now I'm going to go to the columns page here, and that's going to list all of the available columns from that table. So it's gone out, looked at the table, gathered the schema information, and is displayed that. And it's assuming that I want to return and use all of the data from that table. More specifically, it means that these are the fields of data that are going to define the schema of the data that goes into the pipeline. It's going to read the data from the table and then insert it into the pipeline from these columns within the table. And then the pipeline is going to see these column names as it flows through the data flow pipeline. All right, now if I want to, I can select these and change the names of the columns. And that's a fairly common thing that I want to do. The scenario where I might do that is that if I'm going to be putting these into another existing table, and that table, the destination table, uses different column names, somewhere along the line I have to change the column names or map the columns of the pipeline into the destination. So I can do it here at the source, I can do it someplace along the way using a transformation, or I can do a final mapping in the destination to the columns. So you have a lot of options in how you do that. Okay, but I'm just going to leave all the column names, the defaults. I don't need to change anything for this simple example. So at this point, I'll click on OK, and now we've configured that OLEDB data source. Notice the red X has gone away, and so it's happy with the selections. Now, my selections may still be wrong, or there may be a runtime problem, but the component is configured so that Integration Services thinks that it will run correctly. Okay, a couple other things. I'm going to go back into the columns item here. Just a little bit about this. You can very quickly select all or a few columns and then come in and select just random ones. So you have that option up there. So I'm going to select all of them. And then as I mentioned, you don't have to use all of the columns. So if I select all of them, I don't have any use for example, the password hash or salt. I don't need to include that within the list of columns. So in this case, what's going to happen is that the data is going to be read from the table, but then as I have it configured now, password hash and password salt are not going to be inserted into the pipeline. Rather than doing a select star using Transact SQL, I'm doing a select company name, comma, salesperson, comma, email address, and so forth, but not including a couple fields. So same sort of thing going on there. But in this case, I'm going to use all of the available columns. The idea here is that you only want to bring along the data that you're actually going to use, that you need to transform, that you're going to use in a transformation in some way, or that it's going to be output to the destination. Because if you bring along all 100 fields from a table and then use only 5 of them, that's just wasting memory. Your package is going to execute more slowly. It's just all kinds of problems. So just like doing a query within any kind of application, only bring along the actual data that you're going to use for the application. Okay, so I have them all selected, and I'll save the package at this point.